Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we break down complex topics into digestible pieces. This time we're going deep on a single source. A research paper titled Evaluating Trump's Impact on Democratic Pillars.
You can think of it as a health check on American democracy under Trump.
Exactly. We're looking at his first term, the lead up to the 2024 election, and even the early days of his second term.
The paper uses 10 pillars as a framework.
Sort of the essential ingredients for a functioning democracy.
Right. We'll go through each one and see how they held up under Trump and what that might mean going forward. So the 10 pillars they identify are rule of law, separation of powers, free and fair elections, fundamental rights and freedoms, an independent judiciary, political pluralism, free press and access to information, civil society participation, accountability and transparency, and equality before the law.
Quite the list.
Each one is critical. It's like the legs of a table.
Yeah, if one gets weak, the whole thing is wobbly.
Exactly.
So let's start with rule of law. The idea that everyone is subject to the same laws, applying fairly and consistently, even those in power. The paper points to several areas where Trump's actions maybe didn't quite line up with that principle.
His dealings with the Justice Department are a big one.
Right. Publicly criticizing Attorney General Sessions for recusing himself from the Russia investigation. Yeah. Trying to influence investigations, even trying to fire Special Counsel Mueller.
All of that raised questions about whether he was trying to obstruct justice.
Interfere with law enforcement doing their job.
Exactly. And then there are the pardons. Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Michael Flynn, all close associates convicted of serious crimes.
A lot of people saw those pardons as putting loyalty above the law.
And potentially undermining public trust in the justice system.
The paper also mentions Trump's attacks on judges who ruled against him.
Like Judge Gonzalo Curiel, who oversaw that case involving Trump University.
Those attacks sometimes got pretty personal.
Based on ethnicity or perceived political leanings?
Not exactly projecting an image of impartial justice.
Right. And then there's the removal of inspectors general. People whose job it is to oversee government agencies and investigate wrongdoing.
Like Michael Atkinson, the Intelligence Community Inspector General who handled the whistleblower complaint about Trump's Ukraine call.
Getting rid of those watchdogs definitely weakens internal checks and balances.
Makes it harder to hold the executive branch accountable.
Exactly.
Then there's the whole border wall funding saga. Trump using emergency powers to get money after Congress said no.
Bypassing the normal legislative process, a lot of people saw that as an overreach of executive power.
Okay, so that's rule of law. Let's move on to the next pillar, separation of powers. The idea of dividing government authority to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful.
The paper argues that Trump blurred the lines between those branches quite a few times.
The border wall funding is a good example. Bypassing Congress like that raised concerns about the balance of power.
And then there's this constant effort to block congressional investigations, refusing to comply with subpoenas, ordering aides not to testify, blocking documents.
Basically preventing Congress from doing its job of oversight.
Exactly. And then there's the constant criticism of judges, especially those who ruled against his policies.
Calling them Obama judges or so-called judges.
Undermining the legitimacy of a whole branch of government.
Then there was the habit of appointing people to acting positions, bypassing the Senate confirmation process.
Which raises questions about accountability.
And, of course, the allegations about trying to influence the Justice Department, especially in cases involving his allies.
If true, that would be a pretty serious breach of separation of powers.
All right, let's move on to the third pillar. Free and fair elections, kind of the bedrock of any democracy. The paper argues that Trump's actions, particularly after the 2020 election, had a really negative impact on public trust in the system.
The constant claims about widespread voter fraud are a big part of that.
Despite those claims being repeatedly debunked by election officials, by courts, by his own Justice Department.
It didn't stop him from pushing that stolen election narrative, which culminated in the January 6th insurrection.
A direct attack on the peaceful transfer of power.
Then there was the pressure on state officials to change election results.
That phone call to Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger is hard to forget.
Trump urging him to find enough votes to change the outcome.
And then there's the support for restrictive voting laws in several states.
Often justified by those unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud, which critics see as an attempt to suppress voter turnout.
especially among minority voters.
Exactly. And then there's the endorsements.
Backing candidates who denied the legitimacy of the 2020 election.
Normalizing election denialism, making it that much harder to trust future elections.
So that's free and fair elections. Let's move on to fundamental rights and freedoms. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. The paper identifies several areas where Trump's actions and rhetoric may have infringed on those freedoms.
The attacks on the media are probably the most prominent example.
Fake news, enemies of the people. That kind of language creates a hostile environment for journalists.
And it can lead to real-world harassment and intimidation.
His administration also took concrete steps to limit press access, revoking credentials, cutting back on White House press briefings.
Controlling the narrative.
And then there were the threats of lawsuits against media organizations.
A way to silence critics through financial pressure.
Then there were the restrictions on protests near federal buildings.
Citing security concerns.
But critics argue those restrictions were often applied selectively, a way to suppress dissent.
His approach to religious freedom is also worth noting.
Presenting himself as a champion of religious liberty, but then implementing policies that negatively impact religious minorities, like the travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries.
Favoring some groups while discriminating against others.
And we can't forget about social media.
Freedom of speech is crucial, but Trump used platforms like Twitter to spread misinformation, attack critics, and incite his followers.
It raises questions about the limits of free speech and the responsibility of those platforms.
The sheer volume of personal attacks and inflammatory rhetoric contributed to a toxic online environment.
And all the legal challenges facing Trump, both during and after his presidency, raise questions about accountability.
Is he being held to the same legal standards as everyone else?
The fact that lawsuits against him seem to disappear or stall fuels that perception of him being above the law.
All right, let's move on to the next pillar. An independent judiciary.
Essential for any democracy. The paper looks at how Trump's actions and rhetoric impacted the court's ability to function freely and fairly.
His appointment of 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court is a major factor.
Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett.
All confirmed through a highly partisan process.
Shifting the balance of the court for a generation.
Exactly.
And then there are the attacks on individual judges.
Obama judges, so-called judges.
Undermining their authority and legitimacy.
Especially those handling politically sensitive cases.
And the paper also details allegations that Trump tried to interfere with investigations and legal proceedings.
Putting pressure on the Justice Department to make decisions that would benefit him, a serious threat to an independent judiciary if true.
The paper does acknowledge that many federal judges, particularly in lower courts, pushed back against those pressures.
Ruling against Trump's policies on numerous occasions, showing that there's still some resilience in the system.
But the long-term impact of those attacks on the judiciary is still a concern.
Okay, so moving on to political pluralism. Having a diverse range of political viewpoints, parties, and ideologies, that's essential for a healthy democracy. The paper looks at how that fared under Trump.
And they point to the increasing polarization of American politics.
Trump's rhetoric often made that divide worse,
Painting opponents as enemies.
making compromise and civil discourse almost impossible.
And the attacks on institutions didn't help either.
Congress, the judiciary, the media.
Portraying them as corrupt elitist.
Undermining public trust in the very systems that are meant to ensure a fair and balanced political system.
The paper also talks about the shrinking space for dissent within the Republican Party itself.
Moderates who dared to criticize Trump faced a backlash. Primary challenges.
Loyalty to Trump became the most important thing.
Even at the expense of traditional conservative principles.
Third parties also continued to struggle.
The two-party system makes it extremely difficult for alternative voices to gain traction.
And then there's the issue of media polarization.
The rise of partisan outlets.
People getting their news from sources that only reinforce their existing beliefs.
Creating echo chambers.
Making it harder to have productive conversations across the political divide.
And Trump's attacks on the media only made that worse.
Fake news. Enemies of the people.
Actively promoting alternative media that aligned with his views.
Undermining trust in legitimate sources of information. Then there's the whole effort to delegitimize the electoral process.
Sowing distrust in the system itself.
With unfounded claims of voter fraud.
Eroding confidence in democratic processes.
And the embrace of populism and anti-establishment sentiment.
Often translating into attacks on institutions that are crucial for a functioning democracy.
Trying to weaken their legitimacy and their ability to hold the executive branch accountable.
And even after his re-election in 2024, he continued to advocate for changes to electoral laws,
Like stricter voter ID requirements, limits on mail-in voting.
which critics see as attempts to suppress voter turnout, especially among minorities.
The paper concludes that while political pluralism has taken a hit, the fact that Trump faced opposition both within his party and from the broader electorate shows that commitment to democratic values is still there.
But vigilance is needed to safeguard those values in the face of these ongoing challenges.
Okay, so let's move on to free press and access to information,
Crucial for holding those in power accountable.
and for making sure citizens have access to a range of viewpoints and reliable information.
We've already touched on Trump's attacks on the media,
Fake news, enemies of the people,
a direct threat to press freedom,
undermining public trust in legitimate sources.
and creating a hostile environment for journalists.
His administration also took concrete steps to limit press access,
Revoking credentials,
limiting White House press briefings.
controlling the narrative,
And then there were the threats of lawsuits.
financial pressure to silence critics.
The paper also points out that Trump gave preferential treatment to outlets that aligned with his views,
Granting them exclusive access, sidelining the critical ones,
contributing to media polarization.
limiting the range of viewpoints available to the public,
And then there's social media,
using platforms like Twitter to spread disinformation, to make unsubstantiated claims,
muddying the waters,
making it harder to separate fact from fiction,
undermining trust in reliable sources of information.
creating a fertile ground for conspiracy theories.
And the paper also notes an increase in safety risks for journalists covering Trump and his supporters,
Harassment, intimidation.
making it harder for them to do their job safely.
Then there's the issue of Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests.
A way for journalists and the public to access government records,
Those requests were routinely slowed down or denied under the Trump administration
making it harder to hold the government accountable.
to investigate what's really going on.
The paper concludes that Trump's actions and rhetoric represent a significant threat to the free press,
A threat to access to information.
essential components of a healthy democracy.
Okay, let's move on to civil society participation.
The involvement of citizens in shaping and influencing their government.
NGOs, grassroots movements, advocacy groups,
The research paper highlights the emergence of powerful movements during Trump's presidency,
the Women's March, Black Lives Matter.
showing the power of civil society to mobilize people and demand change,
But the paper also points out that Trump's relationship with NGOs was often adversarial.
especially towards organizations that challenged his policies or advocated for progressive causes.
Environmental groups, human rights organizations. He often tried to delegitimize those groups and their work.
In contrast, he had strong ties with conservative think tanks and advocacy groups.
The Heritage Foundation, the NRA.
They played an influential role in shaping his agenda.
It's a pretty clear pattern of favoring groups that align with his ideology,
The paper also raises concerns about how Trump portrayed protests and activism,
especially those opposing his policies,
labeling them as disruptive, dangerous,
which often led to a heavy-handed response from law enforcement.
like we saw with the Black Lives Matter protests,
Excessive force against peaceful protesters,
creating a climate of fear.
discouraging people from speaking out.
And the paper notes that he supported legislation that could be seen as suppressing civil society's ability to organize and protest,
Those anti-protest laws increasing penalties for protesters,
making it harder to hold demonstrations,
often targeting environmental activists and indigenous groups,
an attempt to silence dissent.
to restrict the right to peaceful assembly,
While he did encourage participation through religious organizations,
particularly those aligned with his conservative agenda.
there were also concerns about him using religious freedom as a justification for discriminatory policies.
Against LGBTQ individuals or religious minorities.
And then there's the use of social media to undermine civil society movements.
Criticizing and delegitimizing organizations on Twitter.
Black Lives Matter, environmental groups, labor unions,
Not just trying to discredit their work, but also mobilizing his followers against them,
creating a hostile online environment.
making it that much harder for these groups to operate effectively.
The paper concludes that while civil society in the U.S. is still strong,
And plays a vital role in advocating for change and holding those in power accountable.
the challenges posed by Trump's approach require us to be vigilant.
We need to actively defend the space for free and active civic participation. All right, so let's dive into the ninth pillar, accountability and transparency. It's all about making sure the government operates openly and that those in power are held responsible for their actions.
It's about public trust, right? And making sure power isn't abused. The paper takes a close look at how these principles fared under Trump, and there are some pretty concerning findings.
One of the biggest red flags is Trump's frequent use of executive privilege to basically shield information from Congress and the public. He used this power to block testimony and the release of documents, especially when investigations were looking into his administration's actions.
That kind of resistance to oversight raises some serious doubts about transparency. It makes you wonder if they were really committed to letting people scrutinize what they were doing.
Right, and the paper also points out this pattern of not complying with public records requests. Delays and denials of FOIA requests became pretty common.
FOIA requests, those are the ones that allow anyone to ask for government documents, right?
Exactly. They're a crucial tool for journalists, researchers, and really anyone who wants to understand government actions.
So blocking those requests limits transparency and the public's right to know what's going on.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole saga with Trump's tax returns. He refused to release them, breaking a precedent set by previous presidents.
That raised a lot of eyebrows. People were worried about conflicts of interest, lack of financial accountability. It just fueled suspicion about what he was hiding.
And the way Trump used presidential pardons also raises concerns about accountability. The paper highlights how he frequently pardoned individuals who were loyal to him or who had been convicted of crimes that benefited him politically.
It seemed like those pardons were more about rewarding allies and obstructing justice than about following normal judicial processes or considering recommendations for clemency.
It sent a message that people in Trump's inner circle were above the law.
The paper also points out that Trump would often selectively declassify information, usually when it served his political agenda, while keeping other information hidden from the public.
This selective release of information without context or justification makes intelligence seem political and undermines the integrity of government agencies.
It makes people question the information they're getting. And then there's Trump's efforts to weaken oversight mechanisms within the executive branch itself. He removed several inspectors general who were supposed to be keeping an eye on government agencies and investigating wrongdoing.
It felt like retaliation against anyone who was critical of his administration or investigating things he didn't want investigated.
And the way classified documents were handled, especially that whole situation with taking sensitive materials to Mar-a-Lago, really demonstrated a disregard for the rules.
That raised serious national security concerns. It showed a pattern of ignoring established procedures for personal benefit.
The paper also talks about Trump's refusal to cooperate with congressional investigations. He told his people not to testify and blocked them from releasing documents.
It was a direct attempt to prevent Congress from doing its job of overseeing the executive branch. It weakened the separation of powers and that system of checks and balances that's so crucial for a functioning democracy.
So basically, the paper finds that Trump's approach to accountability and transparency was a major departure from democratic norms.
It raised serious concerns about potential abuses of power and a disregard for the principles of open and accountable governance.
Okay, so let's turn to the last pillar. Equality before the law. This means everyone is treated fairly and equally by the legal system, regardless of their status, power, or connections.
It's a fundamental principle of a just society. And the paper analyzes how this principle held up under Trump's leadership, both during his presidency and after his reelection.
One thing that stands out is the difference between how legal cases involving Trump himself have been handled compared to cases involving ordinary citizens.
For example, there are numerous lawsuits against Trump about various things, financial misconduct, defamation, but many of them seem to have disappeared or stalled after his reelection in 2024.
It raises questions about whether powerful people are held to the same legal standards.
It looks like Trump's use of executive privilege and claims of presidential immunity might be shielding him from legal scrutiny.
But there is one exception that the paper points out: the Georgia election interference case. That one has continued even after his reelection.
And that might be because state-level charges are harder to dismiss with claims of executive immunity.
So it's a situation where you have a high-ranking official potentially avoiding accountability, which undermines the whole idea of equality before the law.
And beyond cases directly involving Trump, there are concerns about systemic bias in the justice system itself.
Even though he signed the First Step Act, which was a criminal justice reform bill, his actions and rhetoric often seem to contradict those reforms.
Take his response to the Black Lives Matter protests, for example. He advocated for harsher punishments for those protesters while downplaying the actions of the rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
Most of those Capitol rioters were white. So it created this perception of a double standard based on race, which just reinforces concerns about bias in the legal system.
It makes people question whether everyone really is receiving equal treatment under the law.
And the paper also points to a pattern of selective enforcement. Trump's political opponents often faced investigations and prosecutions, while his allies and supporters seemed to get more lenient treatment even when facing serious charges.
That kind of selective justice driven by political motivations instead of legal principles erodes trust in the system's fairness.
It makes people think the law is being used as a weapon against certain groups.
And the impact of Trump's appointments to the federal judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, also raises concerns about the future of legal equality.
With a conservative majority on the court, there are worries about how key cases on voting rights, affirmative action, and other civil rights issues will be decided.
It could lead to rulings that weaken protections for marginalized communities and further erode legal equality.
The paper also points to Trump's use of presidential pardons, often to benefit allies or those convicted of crimes that served his interests.
Those pardons were often granted without regard for judicial processes or recommendations, which raises questions about favoritism and unequal application of the law.
It seems like political connections could make a difference in how justice is applied.
And then there are Trump's immigration policies, particularly the travel ban targeting Muslim-majority countries and the family separation policy at the border.
Those policies were widely criticized for being discriminatory and for disproportionately impacting certain racial and religious groups.
The way those policies were implemented with harsh enforcement and a disregard for the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers makes you wonder if equality before the law really applies to everyone in the United States.
There's also this stark contrast between Trump's response to different forms of civil unrest.
His administration took a very aggressive law and order approach to the Black Lives Matter protests, often involving federal forces and heavy-handed tactics.
But their response to the January 6th Capitol riot, which was mainly carried out by Trump supporters, was much more lenient.
It was a striking difference. The BLM protesters were often labeled as thugs or anarchists, while the Capitol rioters were downplayed as patriots or protesters.
It suggests a double standard based on political affiliation, which raises concerns about bias in law enforcement and unequal justice.
So the paper's conclusion is that Trump's presidency and his re-election have significantly challenged the principle of equality before the law in the United States.
His actions and rhetoric contributed to this idea that the legal system can be manipulated for political purposes, and that people in power, especially those connected to Trump, are not held to the same standards as everyone else.
And that erosion of legal equality weakens the foundation of a just and democratic society. It means we have a lot of work to do to ensure the law applies fairly to everyone.
Now, the paper shifts gears a bit to look at something called Project 2025 and what it could mean for the future of American democracy.
So Project 2025 is a major initiative that was put together by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank.
And it's basically a comprehensive plan for how they would reshape the federal government to align with conservative policy goals.
What makes it so relevant is that several people who have been nominated for key positions in Trump's new administration were involved in developing this project.
So there's this concern that the recommendations in Project 2025 might actually be implemented.
And that could have significant implications for how our democracy functions under Trump's second term.
Some of the nominations that have raised red flags include Tulsi Gabbard for the Director of National Intelligence, Pete Hegseth, for Secretary of Defense Elon Musk, and Vivek Ramaswamy as co-leaders of the Department of Government Efficiency, Brendan Carr as FCC Commissioner Pam Bondi, for Attorney General Linda McMahon for Secretary of Education, and Tom Homan as Border Czar.
It seems like there's a push towards a more centralized and ideologically driven approach to governing.
Let's break down some of these nominations and how they relate to the democratic pillars we've been talking about.
For example, Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, raises concerns about a more unilateral approach to foreign policy where Congress is sidelined in decisions about military engagements and intelligence operations.
That could further erode the separation of powers and make it harder to hold the executive branch accountable in these crucial areas.
And then there's Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. He's been very vocal in his support for Trump's policies and has emphasized loyalty within the military.
So there's this worry that the armed forces could become politicized and that internal checks and balances could be weakened.
It could create a situation where dissent and critical thinking within the military are discouraged.
And what about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy leading the Department of Government Efficiency? Their focus seems to be on reducing bureaucracy and government oversight.
That sounds good in theory, but it could lead to deregulation that benefits corporations at the expense of public safety, environmental protection, and the well-being of ordinary people.
And their approach might also involve selectively enforcing regulations to favor certain industries or businesses that align with the administration's ideology.
That would undermine the rule of law and equality before the law.
Brendan Card's appointment to the FCC is also concerning. He's aligned with Project 2025's goal of addressing perceived anti-conservative bias on online platforms.
That raises complex questions about freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
While censorship and bias are legitimate concerns, any efforts to regulate online content need to be carefully considered to avoid violating First Amendment rights and stifling free expression.
Exactly. We need to find a balance. And Pam Bondi's nomination for Attorney General is another one that raises red flags. She has a history of protecting Trump allies from scrutiny while going after his opponents.
So her appointment could lead to the Justice Department being used as a political tool.
It could erode public trust in the justice system and undermine equality before the law.
Linda McMahon's nomination for Secretary of Education aligns with Project 2025's goal of dismantling the Department of Education.
That would represent a major shift towards decentralization and less federal involvement in education.
But it could also exacerbate inequalities in educational opportunities across different states.
It could make it even harder for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to get a quality education.
And then there's Tom Homan for Border Czar,
He's known for his very strict approach to immigration enforcement.
which means we could see a continuation of Trump's hardline immigration policies that have been so widely criticized.
Those policies have been incredibly harsh, and they've had a disproportionate impact on certain communities.
And Homan's appointment could lead to further erosion of due process rights for immigrants and asylum seekers.
It would be another blow to equality before the law.
So when you look at all of these nominations through the lens of Project 2025, it paints a pretty alarming picture.
It looks like a concerted effort to reshape the federal government in a way that concentrates power, reduces accountability, and weakens the institutions that are supposed to check the executive branch,
It's a move towards a more authoritarian style of government.
where dissent is stifled and democratic norms are eroded. And that poses a very real threat to the future of American democracy.
The paper really stresses that even though Project 2025 isn't an official policy, it's a roadmap, and we're seeing it reflected in these nominations.
Right. It's not just a few isolated individuals. It's a whole group of people with a shared vision, and they're being put in positions of power.
And that shared vision seems to be about reshaping the government in a pretty fundamental way.
Exactly.
The paper raises the concern that these changes could really upset the balance of power.
Making it easier for the executive branch to do what it wants.
And harder for other institutions to hold them accountable.
Right.
So one example is this idea of shrinking the federal bureaucracy,
Cutting back on regulations.
which they frame as promoting efficiency, getting the government out of the way.
But it could have unintended consequences.
Yeah, less protection for the environment for consumers,
Weaker financial regulations.
which could really hurt ordinary people.
And benefit corporations and special interests.
So it's not just about efficiency, it's about who benefits from those changes.
Exactly.
And the paper also talks about this emphasis on traditional values in Project 2025,
Trying to limit what they see as progressive ideology in government.
which could translate into policies that harm marginalized groups.
Restricting access to health care, reproductive rights,
Limiting what's taught in school,
trying to control the narrative.
which goes against those principles of equality and individual liberty.
Exactly.
Project 2025 also pushes for a more aggressive foreign policy,
Military strength, less reliance on international cooperation,
which could lead to more conflict,
and undermine efforts to deal with global challenges.
like climate change or nuclear proliferation.
Right, and it also concentrates more power in the executive branch.
Less congressional oversight.
So the paper argues that if Project 2025 is actually put into action, it could have a huge impact on our democracy.
And not a good one.
It's a very different vision of government, more centralized, more ideologically driven.
And it weakens the systems that are supposed to protect individual rights and freedoms.
It's a big departure from what American democracy has been based on.
So the paper ends with a call to action. It's a reminder that the future of our democracy depends on us.
On citizens being informed and engaged.
We need to understand the threats
Hold those in power accountable.
and make sure everyone's voice is heard.
This deep dive has been pretty sobering.
It's a reminder that democracy is fragile.
It takes work to maintain it.
We can't take it for granted.
And this research paper gives us a framework for understanding those challenges.
And hopefully for starting to address them.
It's a call to be vigilant,
To be informed.
to get involved.
Because the future of American democracy is at stake.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.